I've had quite a few requests asking me why I picked the particular ship, the steamship Naparima, to build. So I thought I'd give you a quick history of the ship and the reasons for my choosing her. If you're fortunate or unfortunate, I'm not sure which, you would have seen one of my many videos on model shipbuilding. I think I'm well over 150 at this point in time. And shortly after my quest to start building these boats, I decided that I would concentrate building only ships that relate to the history of Trinidad and Tobago. This all started with the Dr. Seagut, which I built for Angostura, and that's a sailing bark that sank in Trinidad and used to bring Angostura bitters from the Caribbean to Europe. This was followed by a scratch-built model of the steamship Venezuela, which is also in the Angostura Museum on loan to them. And that brought Angostura bitters out of Venezuela to Trinidad, where it would be then put on a sailing bark and taken to Europe. That started me on a deep research of the various vessels that impacted on our history. And that's when I discovered the difficulty in obtaining historically accurate information on ships that are not famous, but relate to a particular place or point in time in history. And that's when I arrived at my research project on the Naparima, which for Trinidad and Tobago perspective was the first inter-island steamship that serviced the ports where the role of the rail didn't offer service, a public service for transport for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. The research, which actually started on Facebook, went into our National Archives and then headed all the way to the National Maritime Museum in London, where I found the plans of the original ship, stored 7 copies of the plans, and that led me to the place I am today where I can actually build the model. The first comprehensive set of data I received from the Lloyds Registry was from a magazine published in 1905 called The Engineer, and that produced a fairly detailed description of the ship from an engineering point of view that led me to the actual plans. And this is the actual digital copy that I got from the National Maritime Museum. It was sent via email to a local printing service, and I was able to download and get a pretty accurate feel for what the model looks like. This was a huge improvement from when I built the model of the Venezuela, which came from a painting by Jean-Michel Casabon. As you can see from the plans, they are fairly detailed, but were full of inaccuracies. And I was able to convince a friend of mine, John Otway, who is an architect, to develop a quarter-inch scale, accurate quarter-inch scale plan that would allow me to build an accurate model of the ship. And these are some of the plans that John produced for me. Absolutely stunning in its detail. I could never be grateful enough to John for the fantastic work he did. You just need to take a look at the detail to understand the time that he spent preparing these wonderful plans. The first part of the research started in our National Archives, and I was fortunate enough to know the director, Roma Wong Sang, who I can, again, eternally grateful. She opened up the archives and allowed me to go in and get all the research. And in the Gazette, which went back to the arrival of this boat in 1905 and its subsequent sinking in 1926, I was literally able to get a lot of the history of the boat, its arrival, and eventually the sinking and the commission of inquiry that followed in the accident. And in the process, I got to meet a very interesting gentleman called Glen Beadon, who lives in England, but who comes from Trinidad, and whose lifelong passion has been documenting the railroads of Trinidad and Tobago, and is in fact in the process of putting out a book on the history of the railroads of Trinidad and Tobago. He knew all about the Naparima, and so I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about the history himself.
I am more of a railway enthusiast, but my interest in Naparima stems from the fact that the Trinidad Government Railway, under a guy by the name of Mr. Smith, general manager, when he came to Trinidad, he wanted to find a way to extend the service from San Fernando, which had opened in 1882, down to the southern ports along the southwest peninsula. And one of the things that the British Railways did in the UK was to have a steamer service. So for instance, you find in parts of Scotland or parts of the West Country, you have the railway terminating, and then there's a steamer service onward to either across the Thames estuary, the Severn estuary or some of these areas. So for me, when Mr. Smith arrived in Trinidad and he was looking at ways to extend the railway, one of the obvious things to do was to have a southern steamer service that would run from San Fernando Jetty all the way down the southwest peninsula. And the Naparima was built by Thornycroft of Southampton, Thornycroft and Company of Southampton. It was tested on the Thames. It's only a 2-foot draft, I believe. And the reason for that was obviously because San Fernando was very shallow. So to get alongside during low tide, you have to have a very shallow draft. And similarly with all the other ports along the southwest peninsula. The Naparima was shipped to Trinidad. Well, it came under its own steam out to Trinidad, and it cost £14,064. It arrived here on I think it was the 15th of June, 1905, and it was, or 16th of June rather, and it was tested on the 17th of July, 1905. It did a run from Port of Spain down to San Fernando. And thereafter it went into service on the southern ports, coming out, connecting with the TGR service down to San Fernando. Such was the demand on the southern ports as the railway expanded and as traffic patterns increased, that there was need for a second steamer, which was the SS St. Patrick, which was also built by Thornycroft and also made its way out to Trinidad under its own steam. So the southern steamer was, although it was used and although it didn't make much money, it didn't make any money in fact, it was quite extensively used, and you'd have people from all those ports now depending on getting onto the southern steamer service. And today you still have jetties, the jetty at Cedros is still there.
There were lots of challenges with the plan. Certainly the hull gave us a lot of issues trying to understand, because this in fact had 2 tunnels and the propellers were housed in the tunnels, so if the ship ever ran aground, the propellers wouldn't actually be damaged or touch the bottom. We also had issues with the boiler. There was not a lot of detail on the Thornycroft boiler, and I spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out what the actual boiler looked like. We found an article in the Engineer going back, I think it was in 1905 or 1906, which actually detailed a lot of the specifications of the ship, and from an engineering perspective described the engines quite well, and had detailed drawings of the engines. So there was no real challenge in working out what the engines looked like, and me trying to figure out whether I should build a non-working copy of the engine.
I think the engine would have been more of a maritime engine.
Yeah.
What I love about this model that you're making here of the boiler, or what is really the firebox,
yeah.
right? You have these 3 entrances here, which you can just imagine the boilerman down below would be opening each of these furnaces here and shoveling coal. And then, of course, stoking the coal as well. You may remember that when you look at the fancy sailor at carnival time, you have these guys that have these long stokers going along, stoking. Well, that's exactly what the boilerman would have been doing here, stoking these fires. You have the boiler on top with the tubes in it, of course, supplied with water, and then the exhaust coming up the top, which would come out the funnel or the chimney at the top. And it was quite a modern engine for its time, a propeller engine as opposed to paddle steamer. The coal originally would have been Welsh coal that was brought from Britain, shipped in, and the same type of coal used for the Naparima and the St. Patrick originally would have been the same coal
Yeah.
used for steam locomotives.
Because Trinidad had some coal at one time.
Trinidad, there's a place in Trinidad called Coalfield, which
Yeah.
is actually south of Sangre Grande, but it was very low quality coal. In fact, the British Admiralty tested it and found that the properties of it were not good enough for the Admiralty. And in fact, by that stage, by the beginning of the First World War, the British Admiralty had already started using crude oil.
Yeah.
In fact, it started burning. That's one of the reasons why Trinidad became such an important place in the British Empire. I mean, for me, just being able to see this model and get an idea of the dimensions of what the Naparima was like. Just the fact that it's called the Naparima, obviously, the area around San Fernando is the Naparima area, which is where the sugar belt was. And in fact, it's historic. It's kind of ironic that they call it Naparima because it's a railway vessel. And in fact, the very first railway in Trinidad ran to the Naparimas, which was a Supero tramway.
Even though these things seem very straightforward, we had a lot of difficulty understanding the drawings, particularly the stern of the boat and the hull. And I decided to help John that the best way I could do this was, in fact, to build a solid wooden hull. And I could use filler as I made errors, and he and I discussed it. And that's what we did here. And you'll see a lot of filler on it because it took quite a while to figure out how to make the hull. And then I decided that I would build an actual complete solid model and work out all the issues there, make all the errors there. And then when the entire thing was finished, then I'd go back and build a plank-on-frame model, which would be the museum quality model. Another challenge that we had was trying to decide when we would actually build the model, what date of the ship would we build. The ship was built in 1905 and sank in 1926, and it actually changed as it went on. For instance, in 1921, the vessel changed from burning coal to burning oil, and I'm not even going to think what the impact that might be on the visual look of the ship, which could impact on the model. So what we decided to do is the solid model would be built within the first year of her arriving in Trinidad, ignoring the configuration she had to bring her across the Atlantic. And maybe, I haven't decided yet, the final model, the plank-on-frame model, would be how she existed just before she sank. In July 2019, we made an attempt to locate the wreck in the second Boca. She had had an accident with the Van Dyke, a passenger steamship, and we were fortunate enough to locate the wreck in 74 feet of water. Unfortunately, the visibility was terrible on that day, and despite best efforts of the dive team and the ROV lent by Robert Stauble, we simply weren't able to actually go down on the wreck. We plan to revisit the wreck site in 2020 at high tide and at the height of the dry season, when visibility should be the best and the tide should be the slackest. We have a ROV that has been loaned to us by Robert Stauble, and we're hoping that we'll get a fairly good idea of the quality of the wreck when she went down. So we'll have an idea of the configuration of the boat, and perhaps that will be the look of the final model. In the meantime, we continue with the construction of the solid model, learning as we go along and making the changes as new facts become available or as we get a better understanding of what this ship looked like during her lifetime in Trinidad. We continue working on the two papers, the Commission of Inquiry, which we have reproduced, and of course the main research paper on the Naparima, which we will make available to anyone when the project is completed. So it's time to finally bring this project to an end. You have a fairly good idea by now of why we chose this particular ship, the SS Naparima, and the process that has gone on to bring this model to completion. When it's all done, I will produce another video, a final video, and I will make available the 2 reports. So if you're interested in more information on the project, feel free to write me at kevinkenny1950@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to respond and give you whatever information you require.